Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're plunging into a paradox that, well, it continues to shape our world. Cast your mind back to November 1989, that joyous, almost cathartic moment the Berlin Wall fell. Can you picture it? This huge 155-kilometer barrier, the absolute physical symbol of a divided world, suddenly just swarmed by crowds, and the sound of pickaxes chipping away at the concrete, that roar of liberation like a collective exhale. It really felt like the end of a long ideological struggle. The dawn of a new era of freedom, the promise of a genuinely united world.
And that's exactly where the the tragic irony of our deep dive really begins, because that physical destruction taking down that one very visible wall, it didn't actually usher in an era of unity. Not really. Instead, it seems to have kicked off a period defined by, well, the rapid erection of new, often invisible barriers. It's almost as if the energy of division, no longer needing that concrete outlet, just sort of diffuse into the very fabric of our societies. We're talking about walls between, say, a triumphant West and an embittered West, walls between the promise of freedom and the increasing demands of security, between what states do and what citizens know, and maybe the most insidious one, the wall between objective truth and deliberately weaponized information. This is the story of what we're calling the troubled peace.
And to help us navigate this complex story, we're framing our deep dive like a musical project, moving through 4 distinct acts. Each act traces the ideological shifts, the evolution of political language, really, from the 1990s right up to today. We'll be looking at how the very language used to justify power has shaped history. And more importantly, what this all means for you, the learner, trying to navigate a world that's increasingly defined by these unseen divisions. Okay, so let's begin with Act 1. The end of history. We've themed this one, the hubris of victory. You can almost feel it, can't you? That palpable optimism of the 1990s right after the wall fell. The sounds, the crowds, news reports just overflowing with a sense of wonder. And that euphoria, it was perfectly captured by Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history thesis. He argued basically that Western liberal democracy wasn't just a good form of government, it was the final form of human government. The big ideological battles. Over. Done. It really felt like a unipolar moment, didn't it? With the United States positioned as this kind of benevolent global leader.
But that clean, optimistic narrative, it got its first crack almost immediately. And it was a brutal one. Just months after the wall fell, Iraq invaded Kuwait in August 1990. And the U.S.-led response, Operation Desert Storm, was this stark display of that new unipolar military might. Its most horrifying moment, perhaps, was the Highway of Death. This was February 26th, 27th, 1991. Coalition aircraft systematically attacked Iraqi forces retreating on Highway 80. They blocked the convoy, created a miles-long traffic jam, and then just destroyed it. One soldier chillingly described it as shooting fish in a barrel.
God, that's grim.
It is. General Norman Schwarzkopf, he justified it by calling the Iraqis a bunch of rapists, murderers, and thugs. But the visceral reality, the images, charred vehicles, descriptions of a swimming pool of blood, it was horrific.
Was there much debate about the proportionality of that attack at the time? Or was it drowned out by the victory celebrations?
Oh, it was debated, definitely. But you're right, the sheer scale of the victory did tend to overshadow the immediate ethical questions for many people. But that debate, it laid some critical groundwork for later discussions about, the appropriate use of American power. And it certainly set a grim precedent for what came next, which was a kind of slow-motion warfare.
And that slow-motion warfare you're referring to, that's the slow decay of Iraq under UN sanctions.
Exactly. After the Gulf War, the UN, heavily pushed by the US and UK, imposed one of the most comprehensive, most devastating sanctions regimes in history on Iraq. Now, the stated goal was disarmament, getting rid of WMDs, but officials openly acknowledged the unstated goal was regime change. The sanctions would stay as long as Saddam Hussein was in power. That was the real message.
And the impact on ordinary Iraqis.
Catastrophic. Just catastrophic. This was a sophisticated country, remember? It imported 70% of its food, and it was deliberately reduced, quote, to a pre-industrial age. Reports from the WHO, from UNICEF, they documented soaring child malnutrition, a complete collapse of the healthcare system, a surge in waterborne diseases because they couldn't even import chlorine to purify water. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of excess child deaths reported. Hundreds of thousands.
Unbelievable.
You hear these personal accounts, professionals selling their furniture just to survive. An entire generation grew up in utter misery. And this policy, this prolonged warfare through sanctions, it utterly failed to dislodge Saddam Hussein.
Yeah.
Instead, it systematically destroyed the Iraqi middle class, its infrastructure. It created a traumatized, broken state. And the ultimate irony, The 2003 invasion, which was later justified by the need to find WMDs and deliver humanitarian aid,
Right.
it came after the sanctions had largely neutralized those WMDs and had themselves caused the very humanitarian crisis they then claimed they were solving. So that 2003 invasion, in many ways, it felt like the inevitable, violent conclusion to a decade of, well, containment by destruction.
It's almost incomprehensible, isn't it? Reducing a country to pre-industrial conditions.
Right.
What do you think was the most devastating long-term consequence of that, beyond the immediate crisis?
I think the complete atomization of Iraqi society. It just shattered the social contract, dismantled institutions, created a population that was deeply traumatized, deeply resentful. This wasn't just suffering. It was the deliberate dismantling of a state, which maybe inadvertently paved the way for much greater instability later on.
So with a first crack and the slow decay really darkening the 90s, it's clear that the end of history was a fleeting dream at best. And that brings us with a jarring jolt into Act 2, the Age of Terror. We've themed this the fervor of the crusade. The shift on September 11, 2001, it just absolutely shattered that post-Cold War peace. We all remember watching those meticulously planned attacks live, don't we? The searing images of the towers collapsing. And the raw audio from that day, air traffic control, first responders, news reports, it captures that escalating panic in a way few other moments really do.
And that same evening, President George W. Bush addressed the nation. He framed the event not just as a crime, but as cosmic evil. He vowed to rid the world of evil and famously declared, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." Then, a few months later, in his State of the Union address, he solidified this Manichaean worldview, the stark division, absolute good versus absolute evil. He identified an axis of evil, Iran, Iraq, and North Korea, explicitly linking state actors to the terror threat. It signaled a new, much broader front in this war on terror.
So this wasn't just about hitting back. It was a fundamental redefinition of America's role in the world, framed in almost spiritual, moral terms. And this laid the groundwork for the doctrine that drove the Bush administration's response. It was this potent mix of neoconservative ideology, activist foreign policy, American exceptionalism, military dominance, promoting democracy abroad, by force if necessary. And it fused with this particular brand of compassionate conservatism. Remember, the faith-based and community initiatives, partnering with religious charities, the armies of compassion, to solve social problems at home.
Well, what's fascinating here is how these seemingly quite different policies actually connected. Both really stemmed from the same core belief in American exceptionalism. America as a chosen nation, with a mission to combat evil and spread its values, whether fighting poverty at home or tyranny abroad. The war on terror was explicitly framed as an ideological and moral struggle, almost a theological project, really, characterized by this absolute certainty, this unwillingness to compromise. And that absolute certainty, rooted in this moral crusade, it paradoxically led to a kind of blind spot regarding unintended consequences and, well, the creation of new enemies. The 9/11 attacks didn't create this doctrine out of whole cloth, but they absolutely created the political and emotional environment for its implementation on an unimaginable scale.
And to launch the war in Iraq, the administration really needed to convince a skeptical world. The pivotal moment for the case was Secretary of State Colin Powell's address to the UN Security Council, February 5th, 2003. It was quite dramatic, wasn't it? A multimedia presentation laying out the case for Iraq having WMDs and links to al-Qaeda. You can almost hear him declaring, "Every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. What we're giving you are facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence."
Right. And what's truly unsettling looking back is that while it was a masterpiece of persuasion, a real performance, it was tragically built on flawed, exaggerated, and sometimes, frankly, fabricated intelligence. Powell himself would later call the speech a blot on his record. He admitted the intelligence case just fell apart almost immediately afterwards. That moment, it really represents the peak of the state's ability to, well, manufacture a reality, to project this unshakable certainty to justify a course of action they'd already decided on, and it deeply, deeply undermined trust in official pronouncements, maybe more than anything before it.
It's incredible, isn't it? How a single presentation, even one built on such shaky ground, can shape history like that. What does that tell us about the power of narrative, or maybe even propaganda, in those crucial moments?
Well, it speaks volumes about the human desire for clear answers, I think, especially in moments of intense fear and uncertainty like after 9/11. When a powerful narrative is presented with conviction and seemingly backed by solid evidence, it can sometimes override critical thinking, even for very smart people.
Yeah.
That desire for decisive action, it made people susceptible to a story that provided a clear enemy and a clear path forward, even if the foundations were weak.
And then came the invasion itself. Shock and awe. March 19, 2003. Massive aerial bombing, followed by that rapid ground invasion, those daring armored thrusts, the thunder runs straight into Baghdad, all designed to psychologically shatter the enemy's will and Saddam's regime. It collapsed within weeks. Now, as that triumphant fanfare starts to fade, we enter Act 3, the reckoning, blowback, and moral collapse. We've themed this the monster in the mirror, because this is where the very methods used to fight evil began to, well, mirror the barbarism of the enemy, eroding moral authority and, unintentionally, creating whole new sets of adversaries.
And the most visible stain on American moral authority, the one everyone remembers, became public in April 2004. The Abu Ghraib prison photographs. Those images, they just shocked the world, didn't they? Naked prisoners stacked in pyramids, hooded figures attached to wires, smiling American soldiers standing next to clearly abused detainees. And the official line was, a few bad apples. But it quickly became clear this was more systemic, a breakdown rooted in policy decisions. It flowed directly from things like the torture memos from the Department of Justice, which very narrowly redefined torture to permit so-called enhanced interrogation techniques. And the choice of Guantanamo Bay, specifically chosen so detainees would have effectively no legal rights under U.S. or international law. These weren't just physical places. They were, in a way, philosophical constructs. Spaces where law, morality, accountability were deliberately suspended. It was like reverse engineering legal justification to legitimize what was otherwise clearly illegal. And this policy resulted in systematic torture, waterboarding, stress positions, sleep deprivation, sexual humiliation. Horrific stuff, with corrosive effects on both the detainees and, frankly, the guards involved, too.
So this wasn't just an isolated incident then. It really sounds like a deliberate philosophical shift. How did those policy decisions, like the torture memos, fundamentally undermine the very values the war on terror claimed it was upholding?
Precisely. That's the core contradiction. The stated goal was fighting evil, spreading democracy, upholding freedom. But the means employed directly contradicted those ends. By adopting tactics that mirrored the brutality of the enemy and by creating these legal black holes to justify them, the U.S. forfeited a huge amount of its moral standing on the global stage. It made it incredibly difficult to credibly advocate for human rights or the rule of law elsewhere when your own actions were so clearly violating them.
And this erosion of moral authority, it also fueled the privatization of violence, didn't it? Like the Nassour Square Massacre, September 16, 2007. Blackwater mercenaries, protecting a U.S. diplomat, opened fire in Baghdad. 17 Iraqi civilians killed, including children. And there were conflicting accounts about whether the shooting was provoked or not.
Right. And that massacre starkly highlighted the U.S. government's increasing reliance on private military contractors, PMCs, who operated in this perilous legal gray area, often with immunity from local Iraqi laws. This outsourcing of violence created a force that was accountable neither to the military chain of command nor certainly to the Iraqi people. It bred immense resentment. It further alienated the local population and actively undermined the mission by, well, creating more enemies than it eliminated.
So by outsourcing the violence, did it also effectively outsource accountability, making it harder for anyone to truly answer for what happened?
Absolutely. The lines of command, the lines of responsibility, they became incredibly blurred. It made it notoriously difficult to prosecute wrongdoing, even when it was blatant. And that sense of impunity, that feeling that these guys could get away with anything, only amplified the resentment and distrust among Iraqis.
And all of this, it seems, contributed to the unraveling, perhaps best exemplified by the intervention in Libya in 2011 during the Arab Spring. The UN Security Council authorized military intervention using the Responsibility to Protect Doctrine, R2P, which was a concept born from the failures to stop genocides in the 1990s, right? Intended to ensure the world would never again just stand by.
Exactly, a noble idea on paper. However, the NATO-led intervention very quickly morphed from civilian protection into outright regime change, leading to Gaddafi's overthrow and, ultimately, his death. But here's the crucial consequence, the blowback. Gaddafi had spent decades systematically destroying Libya's state institutions. He eliminated any form of civil society, any independent power base. So when he fell, it created this immense power vacuum, plunging the country into a decade of chaos, lawlessness, civil war, just utter collapse. And crucially, this instability in Libya, combined with the ongoing civil war in Syria, provided incredibly fertile ground for the remnants of al-Qaeda in Iraq, AQI, which then rebranded itself as ISIS, or ISIL. Exploiting the grievances, exploiting the power vacuums, ISIS stormed across the border from Syria in 2014, captured Mosul, and declared a new caliphate. This was the ultimate blowback from the 2003 invasion. A terror state more brutal, more ambitious than al-Qaeda had ever been. The war on terror, it became this self-perpetuating machine, constantly generating its own enemies, a truly dissonant, unending symphony of conflict.
Wow. It's such a stark example of unintended consequences, isn't it? A humanitarian intervention, R2P, leading to such profound instability and the rise of something even worse. How did that power vacuum become such fertile ground for ISIS?
Well, without any legitimate state structures, without functioning security forces, and combined with all the deep-seated grievances from years of Gaddafi's oppressive rule, there was just no central authority capable of resisting them. ISIS offered this brutal but clear alternative. They skillfully exploited local resentments, sectarian divisions, and just filled the void. They attracted fighters, disillusioned individuals, people who felt they had nothing left to lose.
Which brings us then to our final act. Ghost in the machine, information is the new battlefield. The theme here is the loss of control. We shift from physical battlefields to the invisible world of information, where secrets get exposed and data itself becomes a weapon.
And the challenge to that post-Cold War unipolar consensus was articulated incredibly clearly by Russian President Vladimir Putin. His Munich Declaration, February 10, 2007. In a speech that genuinely shocked Western leaders at the time, he condemned what he called the uncontained hyperuse of force by the United States. And he stated flatly that a unipolar world was not only unacceptable, but also impossible. He explicitly condemned NATO's eastward expansion as a serious provocation. He directly asked, against whom is this expansion intended? That speech, looking back, was such a clear warning. It laid out grievances that would later be used repeatedly to justify the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. It really marked the official public fracture of that post-Cold War consensus, the end of any remaining illusion of the end of history.
That speech really does sound like a seismic shift in global politics, a direct challenge to that whole unipolar moment idea. Were Western leaders truly listening back then, or did they kind of underestimate the depth of that resentment?
You know, the initial reaction in the West was largely dismissive. Many saw it as just a return to old Cold War rhetoric, maybe posturing. I think many did underestimate the long-term strategic implications. Perhaps they believed that economic integration, globalization, would eventually override these geopolitical grievances that proved to be a significant miscalculation, didn't it?
Yeah, it seems so. And following this challenge came the revelations from whistleblowers, Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. In 2010, WikiLeaks, led by Assange, published this massive trove of classified U.S. documents. The Iraq and Afghanistan war logs, diplomatic cables, Cablegate. It gave this unvarnished, often deeply uncomfortable look into the actual machinery of war and diplomacy. Revealed civilian casualties, corruption, cynical assessments of allies and adversaries alike.
And then in 2013, Edward Snowden's revelations, exposing the shocking scale of global mass surveillance by the NSA. He showed how the NSA was collecting the phone records of millions of Americans, how it had direct access to the servers of major tech companies, creating what he called a pattern of life for countless individuals. The Snowden effect was immediate. It was global. It sparked this huge worldwide debate on privacy versus security. And it significantly damaged the reputation of the U.S. government and also the U.S. tech industry. What's fascinating here is how Assange and Snowden demonstrated that the state's greatest strength, its ability to collect and control vast amounts of information, was also its greatest vulnerability. And the debate just raged. Were they heroes exposing government overreach, or traitors damaging national security? This was a profound kind of informational blowback, where the very tools built for security became the source of the most significant security breaches. The state lost control of its own narrative.
It really feels like those tools meant for security inadvertently opened the door to a completely new kind of vulnerability. How did that idea of radical transparency then get twisted into a weapon for radical doubt?
That's the tragic evolution, isn't it? The initial leaks, whatever their intent, whether to expose hidden truths or just cause disruption, They created this profound skepticism towards all official sources, not just the U.S. government, but institutions generally. And this vacuum of trust was then expertly exploited. Take the 2016 U.S. presidential election. Russian intelligence services hacked the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, and then supplied stolen emails directly to WikiLeaks. And those leaks, which showed the DNC's internal bias against Bernie Sanders, they dominated the news cycle for weeks, significantly damaging Hillary Clinton's campaign.
And this coincided perfectly with the explosion of fake news and disinformation flooding social media, much of it amplified by hostile state actors, like Russia.
Exactly. The public, already primed to be skeptical of official sources after the Assange and Snowden revelations, became incredibly vulnerable to propaganda. Propaganda designed specifically to erode trust, not just in government, but in media, in institutions, in expertise, even in reality itself. The goal shifted. It was no longer necessarily about revealing a specific hidden truth, but about creating an environment where truth itself feels unknowable, where everything is contested. The crusade for transparency had, perhaps inadvertently, paved the way for an era of radical doubt, where citizens struggle to agree on even basic facts, making collective action, even shared understanding, incredibly challenging.
So let's try and bring this all together for you, our listener. Our journey, our sort of four-act play, it began to the joyous fall of a concrete wall in Berlin, symbolizing the end of division. Yet our narrative ends with the erection of arguably the most insidious walls of all, this epistemological wall, the barrier between citizens and any kind of shared sense of reality.
Yeah. The triumphalist ideology of the 1990s, that end of history idea, it shattered under its own contradictions. The brutality of the highway of death, the moral collapse laid bare by Abu Ghraib, the profound strategic failures in Iraq and Libya. Then the leaks. They shattered public faith in the very institutions responsible for those failures, creating this dangerous vacuum of trust. And hostile actors exploited that vacuum brilliantly, not by offering a competing truth necessarily, but by flooding the information space with noise, with disinformation, making it almost impossible for citizens to agree on basic facts. It's left us in this discordant, fractured reality where shared understanding feels increasingly elusive.
So the final thought for you. In a world where people are divided not by concrete and barbed wire anymore, but by entirely separate algorithmically reinforced realities.
Yeah.
What does it truly mean for you to be well-informed? And maybe more profoundly, what are challenges and the responsibilities involved in seeking and discerning truth when the very concept of a shared reality seems to be under attack?